Oh, I thought it was on mute already. Okay, let's start over again. Okay, the topic for these 3 days is self-concept. And what I have in mind for you is quite a large menu. This is all in my book now, so I feel a little bit uncomfortable about presenting it because after writing it and getting just all the words exactly right, I can never possibly duplicate this live. But of course, the advantage of live is you can ask questions and we can interact and you have exercises and so on. So hopefully that will make up for it. You already know something about self-concept. There's a pattern called the swish pattern that I assume you all know and have tried and have used. And in that, you have some behavior or some response that you don't like. You find a cue for that response. When is it about to begin? And then you link that to an image of yourself. This is an image of yourself that is more evolved, that is more capable, that has qualities rather than specific behaviors. And you link those two together with submodalities, and bazingo, it wipes out the old responses. Now, that's an example of a specific method, a specific pattern. It's very, very useful. It's very widely useful for a lot of different things. But it doesn't really tell you how self-concept works. All you know is you build this image, and if you build this image in certain ways, that it has qualities, there's no background, there's no context to limit it in some way. You don't build in specific behaviors. You just look at yourself and you can just tell by that image that this is a person for whom the old response is just no longer relevant, no longer anything to be concerned about. That doesn't really tell you how self-concept works. And what I'm hoping to do here is show you and have you experience how self-concept works in all its details. This is something that I modeled for a period of intermittently over a period of some 14 years or so. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I got really serious about it and tried to answer all the questions that people asked me that I couldn't answer yet. And I think I've got it pretty well worked out now. So it's a comprehensive learning about how this thing works, rather than a specific set of patterns like change personal history or re-imprinting or swish pattern or the phobia procedure and so on. And I have some questions up here I'd like you to think of, particularly if you get bored listening to me, about self-concept. Some of you have been to this class before, and I hope you're here again because it's so interesting and so useful and not because of the ineptitude of my presenting the material. But here's some, assuming some of you have not experienced this before. I'll be speaking mostly to those, and the rest of you will have to think up interesting questions that you think I can't answer. Because that's where I grow and that's where I learn. So here's some questions about self-concept that I hope will be answered as we go through this in exquisite and perhaps excruciating detail. You may get a little tired of how detailed, I'm a detail person. I can live in the land of psychoglobularities, but I don't like to stay there very much. I want to come back down to specific details. Engineers are people who can, and scientists are people who can think, hey, let's go to the moon. But then they get down, well, let's see how we're going to do this, and how many pounds of thrust, and this, that, and the other, and how do we get the guy back from the moon, and all these things. So I'm a detail guy. Some people say the devil is in the details, but I think the efficacy or the ability to get something done is in the details. So here's some questions you might ponder. What is it? What's it made of? What is it for? We all have it. Well, what's it for? We wouldn't have this thing if it wasn't useful. What's its function? Is self-concept the same as self-esteem? A lot of people use the words interchangeably. Why is it so powerful? How about healthy versus unhealthy? What's the difference between a healthy self-concept, say somebody like Christ or Gandhi or something like that, and somebody who's not so healthy like Stalin and Hitler and some of the other folks around? Is self-concept an obstacle to spiritual experience? A lot of spiritual traditions say that having a self-concept will get in the way of union with the all or union with God, or however you want to express it. There are a lot of different ways of expressing this. And I want to give you an overview kind of what we're going to be doing. I'll start with the difference between self-concept and self-esteem. Go into a number of factors that make the self-concept powerful. You know it's powerful. The swish works wonderfully. And it's been known for a long time that if someone has a powerful self-concept, a really good one, they can go through all kinds of hell and difficulties and come out whole at the other end. So what are the aspects that makes it so powerful? Well, the criteria for a healthy self-concept versus a not-so-useful one that doesn't work very well and gets people into trouble. And these are general overall things. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty later. Exactly the small details, but this is kind of an overview. Then when we start getting into the specific structure, I'll be asking you to think of something that you know about yourself that you like, some quality, and get into the structure, and we'll explore structure in great detail. How do you have your self-concept? This is something that is normally unconscious. Most people, if you ask them on the street, are you a kind person? They might say yes or no or maybe. But assuming they said yes, if you then said, well, how do you know that? Their eyes might wiggle around. They might give you some cues with their accessing cues. But they wouldn't know how they had this. This is something like many things in NLP. Submodalities for most people are unconscious. If you walk up to someone on the sidewalk in New York and say, do you make images inside that are still pictures or movies? Most people would go, well, I don't know what you're talking about. But if you then say, well, think of someone that you really care for or that you know well, and give them a pause to do that, and so they go inside and they do that, and then say, no, you just made an image. Is it a still picture or a movie? Then maybe they could tell you. Some people wouldn't, but many people then would be able to tell you. So we'll be dealing in the realm of pre-conscious or experience which is not immediately available to awareness, so there'll be a little bit of struggling at the beginning when we go into structure. Then we'll go into how to use mistakes. If I think I'm a kind person, from time to time I may find that I've been mean to somebody, or somebody else comes up to me and says, oh, that was an awful thing to say. What do I do about mistakes? How can I use that to make my self-concept better, and rather than just going into a funk about it or something? And transforming mistakes is a little subtler way of utilizing mistakes. Building a new quality. Let's say you would like to be different than you are, and you'd like to build a whole new quality for yourself. Using the information that we've gotten from structure and mistakes and transforming mistakes, we can build a whole new quality for yourself. Then show you how you can deal with an uncertain quality. Some things about you go, well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I'm not sure. You often get these kind of head nods or this kind of thing, and this waffling back and forth, ambiguity. Or you can think about it as two parts of a person, that one part says, yeah, you're a kind person, and the other part says, no, you're not, in a different tonality, and perhaps a more convincing one. So how do you deal with uncertain qualities? Because it'd be nice to be congruent. One of the things that we often do in NLP is we are looking for congruence, or working toward congruence, so that we don't have someone who is just a bundle of different motives all going in different directions at the same time, but you can focus and go all for a particular outcome without being ambiguous about it. We'll explore the not self a little bit. This is in terms of what not to do, which is double negation. But not self can get you into trouble just as negative commands get you into trouble, not self. I'm not the kind of person who can, there are some serious pitfalls there in defining yourself by what you're not. And so we'll go into that in some detail. And then we'll go after a negative quality. I'm mean and I really would like to be kind. I don't want to be the way I am. And finally, we'll be going after boundaries. The self defines who I am, and that sort of separates me from the world in a certain way. And there are different ways that this can occur, some of them useful, some of them not so useful. But all of us have certain boundaries around ourselves. Psychiatrists talk about people who have boundary problems, who are confused between their own values and somebody else's, or their own needs and somebody else's, and so on, and how to build boundaries. This is a much more metaphoric kind of thing, but it's very useful. It's the boundaries of the self. Here we're going to the structure of the self. Here we're going to, where does this stop and something else begins? And then, given that you have some kind of boundary, when do you relax it or envelop somebody else in your boundary so there's no boundary between you and something else? And this has some interesting possibilities in terms of mystic experience. And then, and this has to do with connection. How can you have a self-concept that is describes yourself but doesn't separate yourself from others? There are a lot of aspects of that. Some of them I'll describe this morning. So this is kind of a little overview of what we'll be doing. Kind of give you a map for the 3 days. So I'll be talking quite a bit the first hour or so, and then I'll settle down and put you to work. But I want you to have an idea of where I'm coming from with when I talk about self-concept. And perhaps to start with, I think this is in your notes. Do you have notes? Oh, good. Okay. Well, you don't have to write down too much. If you take a quick look at your notes, just enough to know what you don't have to write down, then you can write down something that's interesting and not just duplicate the whole thing. I deliberately use the word self-concept, which is not in I have an old dictionary, one of these great huge things that has every word in the English language, but it's dated 1966. And self-concept does not appear in that dictionary. It's a relatively new word. Identity appears, self appears, a bunch of other things like that. And identity sometimes has religious connotations or philosophical connotations. Self can mean your physical self or your mental self, your emotional self, and so on. The word self-concept is exactly the one I want to use. It's your concept of yourself. Just as you might have a concept of a triangle or a concept of a good relationship, you can have a concept of yourself. So it's simply how you think about yourself or your map of yourself. Now, a map is only useful in that it's inaccurate. This is kind of a funny way of thinking about it. But if I have a map of Winter Park, town where we're living in now, all it is a little piece of paper with a bunch of little lines on it, and maybe a few words. It's a crummy map, but it helps me get around. And if the map were larger and more complete, if the map had all the different trees and all the different creeks and all the different stuff on it, it would be cumbersome. And I'd look at this and I wouldn't be able to find my way around. Now, in the same way, your self-concept is a map of yourself. It's a representation of yourself, and it's relatively incomplete. It could never be complete. If it were complete, it would be it would be so complex that it would be unwieldy. So it's a gross oversimplification. If I say I'm a kind person, that means that most of the time I'm kind. But I'm not kind when I'm asleep. I'm not kind perhaps when I'm driving a car, or there are many, many times in my life when I'm not kind, and maybe sometimes when I'm even mean. But still, it's an oversimplification that's useful, and we'll get back up into some of the other things. But first I want to give you some sense of, again, a kind of an overview of what this is all about. All of us have a huge storehouse of memories. Some of these are forecasts, some of these are things that didn't happen, some of these things are things that we thought happened, but then we found out didn't happen, and all sorts of things. But whatever it is, we have this storehouse of memories in here. Some people think you remember everything that happened to you. I rather doubt it. There's a recent experiment where they showed a bunch of students, I think it was about a 30-second videotape, maybe a little longer, maybe a minute videotape, And what the videotape showed were people in black shirts and white shirts passing a basketball in a room very fast. And the students were given the task of recording how many times people in black shirts passed the ball, because they could pass the ball to a white shirt or a black shirt and so on. They were given this task. And in the middle of this video, a man in a gorilla suit walked on into the middle of this group as they were passing the ball, walked into the middle of the group, beat his chest like this, and then walked off. Total of 10 seconds. Half of the people watching the videotape did not see it. They did not see it. And then when the experimenter rewound the videotape, they were very careful to rewind the same videotape. They rewound it and played it again, and they were accused of deception because they just didn't see it. They were so focused on part of their experience that they did not. This is an experiment in selective inattention. And whatever you're paying attention to, you're paying attention to, and whatever not, you're not. Well, it's the same way with self-concept. You, out of your storehouse of memories, you collect. Well, first you select. If you want to think you're a kind person, you select all the times when you're kind. And then you collect them. You assemble them into a package. And that's what we'll really be exploring, exactly how you do this. But for right now, this is the generalization. And that's your self-concept, which I abbreviate here SC. Now, self-esteem is quite different. Self-esteem is whether you like your self-concept or not. For those who are interested in logical levels, it's a different logical level. It's a generalization. This is a generalization about experience. This is a generalization about your generalization about experience. So if your self-concept is that you're a kind person and you value kindness, then you get to have self-esteem. But if you don't value kindness, if your ideal is to be mean and nasty and cruel and sneaky, then you would not value kindness and you could have bad self-esteem about being kind. My favorite example of this is I heard an interview with a mafia hitman, and he felt very good about his work. He was extinguishing cockroaches, as he called them. And he was upholding the values of his particular society, and he felt very, very good about murdering people. And he was very consistent about it, because he talked about a guy called him up once and says, I want to hire you to hit my mistress. She's pregnant now and making trouble, and he refused to do that. And he said, listen, buddy, you give that lady the $100,000 within a week, or I'll hit you. So he was very consistent about his values. He wasn't waffling. He was very consistent. He had a good set of, I don't want to say a good set of values. He had a consistent set of values. He applied them consistently, and he felt very good about his work. So self-esteem is really very different than self-concept. It's a whole different level of thinking. Any questions about this? This is a very overall picture of self-esteem, self-concept, and a huge generalization about how we form our self-concept. Paul?
Yes, I just wanted, there's some supporting evidence also in that example of the gorilla costume in a movie through that video. I saw several months ago, it was on a computer, and I don't remember where it was located, but there's...
Could you make it short? We got a video going.
There are two sentences, and the word, if I remember right, is if is in there many different times.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm supposed to pick out this word.
Sure.
And most of the time they miss about half of the times that it's in there because
Sure.
of the fact that it's just something that's
well, this is
not really recognized.
Yeah, this is part of the way we process language. We don't process language letter by letter, except when we're small children. We don't even process it word by word. We tend to process language by the phrase. And since your attention is on the phrase, it's a chunking situation, really. But you're not paying attention to the details. Yeah, there are lots and lots of examples of this. Seeing the big picture, but missing the trees. Okay. Let's see. So what is a self-concept? It's a map. I've already described it. It's a map of who you are. It's a description of yourself. as such, it's self-reflexive. I make an image of myself, and I am both the maker of the image and the person who is imaged. And that's another aspect of the power. I should really delay that for a little while. What is it made of? It's made of all the experiences that you put into a package. It has to do with qualities of yourself. Well, that's not quite true. It has many things. I bet I need a new chart that I forgot to put up here. You all know the Dilt's neurological levels, right? Very quickly, what are they? Connection, and then he uses identity, right? See, I would use self-concept, but he has some different ideas about identity. Then beliefs. Values. Yeah, I think that's right. There. Behaviors and environment. Okay. Okay, now, I'm going to say this is basically equivalent to self-concept. Dilts may have some different ideas about that, but I would consider them mostly equivalent. Now, your self-concept really is all of these things. Where you live. I'm a Texan. I'm a Westerner. I'm a New Englander. I'm a whatever. Often people identify part of their self-concept as where they live. I'm a truck driver. I'm a computer programmer. They may describe themselves in terms of their behaviors or what they do for a living. I'm someone who's able to learn. I'm a creative person. Behavior capabilities. Beliefs, you can identify. Again, beliefs are part of your identity too. Connection, your sense of connection, your religious sense or spiritual connection. That's also a very important part of your self-concept. So in a way, all of these feed into self-concept. Now, the interesting thing about this is that people's sense of connection usually is so global and is so large chunk that it's a little hard to explore. It's very, very important. If people have a conversion experience or a born-again experience, it affects all of their life in many, 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 many ways. Very, very powerful. But if you ask them, well, how did that experience happen and what's different now, it's usually hard to get some details. Likewise, you can have a change in behavior that can change your self-concept in quite a ways. This happens in an interesting way, and I think I'll wait on that. If you were to explore people's sense of themselves that's based on their specific behaviors or their location or their environment, you would get something that's so specific that it wouldn't tell you much. It wouldn't give you much information, and if you changed it, it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference typically. And so what we're going to work with here primarily is the general notion of beliefs and especially capabilities, or what I will be using the word quality. I don't mean the quality, quality, I can't talk and write at the same time, I've discovered, but I keep trying. That when I talk about qualities, I am a kind person, I'm an assertive person, I'm a tenacious person, I'm someone who's loyal and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are kind of intermediate in size between spiritual connection with the whole universe versus specific location of environment or specific behaviors. And these are rich enough to be very interesting and provide quite substantial changes in behavior when we change them. And yet they're specific enough that we can deal with them and we can find out what they're made of and how they work. So this is the range that we'll be primarily working with. And then I invite you to explore these other, the smaller chunks and the larger chunks whenever you want to, on your own. But we'll be dealing mostly with these because it's useful for teaching purposes. They're specific enough that you can know what you're dealing with, and general enough that they're really interesting when you change them. So that's one piece there. What is your self-concept for? If you didn't have a self-concept, how would that affect your behavior? How would that affect your life? As far as we know, animals don't have self-concepts. Animals have a lot of behaviors. They can behave contextually in different certain situations. They can behave differently. They can make generalizations. They can know the difference between what is prey and what is not prey, and what is food and what is not food, and things like that. But as far as we know, they don't have a concept of themselves. They probably don't have too much sense of time either. But how would your life be different if you didn't have a sense of who you are? What's that?
We'll be like them, like the animals.
I think you would. In a lot of ways, you'd be like animals. And that means we would not have many of the things that we are. Your self-concept's kind of like a keel on a boat. It keeps it moving in a certain direction, even when times get tough. It's a map of yourself, so that animals have maps of the world, but they don't probably have maps of themselves, as far as we know. Okay, we've gone over some of these general things, and then I'm going to start getting more systematic. Let's see. Okay, I think I'll start getting more systematic. I've already gone over the difference between self-concept and self-esteem. There are many people talk about self-esteem training. There was this whole self-esteem conference in California about 20 years ago, I think. Spent a lot of money and people made a lot of fun of it, but it was one of those things that was well-intentioned, but was a little misdirected, because you can't really work on self-esteem directly. Since self-esteem is a result of your values and your self-concept, if you try to ignore all this and just say, oh, you're a great kid, or something like that, isn't really going to work. That's just something outside. And some people made the mistake of providing other esteem and the idea that this would generate self-esteem. And they're quite two different things. If you look at the things that people do in the name of self-esteem, enhancing self-esteem or improving self-esteem, many of them actually work at this level, which is where you need to work. For example, there's a gal working in a school district in San Jose. I can't think of her name right now, but she did some wonderful things with kids who came from Laos and Cambodia and Mexico and so on, other cultures with different languages. And she, for instance, would have them go through magazines and cut out images of people of their particular ethnic background who had succeeded in life, who become doctors or sports heroes or something like that. And then she would have them paste them up, on a big, make a big collage, like a poster of all these people of that person's ethnic background who had succeeded in life. And then they would have them put them up in their bedroom. And this is a very slick way of assembling a whole bunch of experiences. These weren't memories in this case. This was external rather than internal, but of course it creates an internal experience, and collecting them in a certain way so that they were all up there. And here's something the person could identify with. So in a culture in which, most of the emphasis is on white, etc., success and so on, these kids had something that they could identify with. Oh, I'm one of these people. I can succeed like these people succeeded. And then they could gain some self-esteem. But it was creating a sense of self-concept. I am one of these people, and all of these people are successful, that really made the difference. And the self-esteem was a natural result. Now, why is this so relevant? I'm going to talk a little bit about values because they're so important in self-esteem, but I'm not going to mess with self-esteem. And for the most part, I'm not going to mess with your values. I think those are up to you. And while there's a value in values clarification and getting clear on your values and working out competing values where you have different values in opposition and so on, I think that's kind of up to you. And what I'm going to do is teach you from here to here. How do you select and collect experiences? You can do it in lots of different ways. Some ways work really well, some ways don't work well. So I'm going to teach you how to build self-concept. And I'll leave the values to you. I will assume that you know something about your values and that you'll build a self-concept and work with your self-concept to align them with your values, and then self-esteem is automatic. Is that distinction clear? Any questions at this point? Okay, let's roll right on. So we got a lot to do. Let's see what I've left out so far. Oh, some people talk about a true self. What's your true self? And in a large way of thinking, this is kind of a funny question. It's like, what's the real map of Winter Park? Well, the real map of Winter Park is the one that gets you where you want to go. If you want to find out about the bugs in the trees, then a map of where the bugs congregate and where the trees grow would be useful. If you want to get to the restaurants, then you want a street map with restaurants on them. If you wanted a plat map because you wanted to buy a piece of land here, then you would need a plat map of what are the legal distinctions and which lots are for sale and all the rest of it. So a map is really only something that is useful insofar as it's relevant to your interests and your values. Now, there is a sense in which a true self exists. Well, I think that the notion of true self really comes out of the notion of false self, that clearly there are people around who prance and strut and, oh, I am a very special person and all this stuff. And you just know that there must be something not quite right about that, that they're putting on more than they are. And all of us do this at times. We're going in for a special interview, or we want to impress somebody, or we're going on a TV thing and we want to look, really good on TV or something like that, and we try to be a little more than we are. So there's certainly a sense in which there is such a thing as a false self, of trying to put on a front, trying to create an image of something that we're really not. And of course, people who do this really well are called expert actresses and actors. They really do take on a persona, and they take it on so fully that sometimes they get a little confused about who they really are, especially if they take on a lot of different roles in rapid succession. So there's that sense in which there's a true self, but I would say that the main, the way in which I will use the word true self, and I won't even use it very often, is that you're true to your values, that you have built a self-concept, or you have a self-concept that is in alignment with your values, that there's no internal conflicts and ambiguities in terms of your internal experience. I got some little memory devices here that I don't really use very often, but sometimes they're pretty handy. Let's take a little more time on values. Your values are generalizations. If I have a generalization like honesty is a good thing, I value honesty, or I value authenticity, or plain dealing, or something like that, or loyalty, or whatever it is, that's a generalization about a whole bunch of different experiences, and I'm putting them all together kind of in a package. And one of the things you'll be learning in this is how we generalize about everything. I'll be teaching you how you generalize about yourself, but that's only a special case of how you generalize about other things, how you generalize about mathematics or dogs or triangles or anything else in the world. Self-concept is more interesting because it affects you so strongly. And that's why I focused on it, and where we'll be focusing mostly, but I want you to realize that this is also, how you generalize about everything. Fundamentally, it follows the same principles. Now, often values conflict. We learn some values from society. We may learn one set of values from grandpa, another set of values from mom, another set of values from the kids we hang out with at school or after school. So oftentimes we take on values from others, maybe without testing them to really make sure that there's something that fit with ourselves, that really makes sense of ourselves. So we often have conflicting values. Time enters in. I might really like that dessert now, but I don't like what it'll do to my stomach later. So time is also, values now versus values in the future. Anything you can do to clarify your values and put them in some sort of sequence of importance will be very useful. I think Charles did a thing on hierarchy of values, didn't he, in the last little while? Okay. Just a simple example. You're walking down the street and you see something in a store window and you go, oh, that'd be nice, and you reach for your wallet without thinking, is this really what will satisfy you most? What are all the other things that I could buy with that same amount of money, and would I really enjoy this $50 worth or whatever the value of it is? So it can be very useful to have some kind of prioritization. Well, this is more important to me than this. This is more important to me than this, and so on. And many people do not have a prioritization, and they just see something trinket in a window and I want it, and they grab it. And sometimes they don't even pay for it because they want it, and they want it right now, and they don't think about what else they could do with that money or what are the consequences of grabbing it and not paying for it, and so on. So a hierarchy is useful. On the other hand, it's a lie, because your values change over time. Right now, I hope you're interested in paying attention to me and what I'm talking about and what I'm about to present. But in a little while, you may want to go to the bathroom, and that may be more important than sitting here and listening to me. You may think of a phone call you need to make to someone at home. Oh, I forgot to tell them about so-and-so, or the pot's on the stove, or something like that. And then that becomes the most important thing. So, in fact, our values change through time. What is the most important thing? At any one moment in time, you can say there's a hierarchy. At any one moment in time, you're paying attention to one thing and not to some certain other things. At this moment, you're probably not paying much attention to the feeling inside your knees, on the backside of your knees, until I mention it, and then, of course, your attention tends to go there. There are all kinds of things to pay attention to. How do you pay attention to what's important to you? Well, your values shift. They shift in time. They shift in place, contextually. If you're in certain contexts, certain things become more important to you. If you're up on a ski slope, you probably don't want to sit down and write notes for some book you're writing. It's time to ski. So skiing is more important. That context, in a sense, demands a certain change in values, and that's appropriate. So in reality, what's going on is something called a heterarchy. And this is a word that's not much used, so I need to explain it a little bit. And also the origin of the word. Quite some time ago, a guy was studying the reticular activating system. This is your brain. And in the brainstem here is a set of neurons called the reticular activating system. And if you make certain kinds of lesions in these, the animal will be awake all the time and very distractible, sort of ADHD. And if you make certain other lesions, the animal will go to sleep. This is a particular set of neurons that govern attention. And attention, if you think about it, is the very foundation of values. What do you notice in the world? Well, you notice what's important to you. And you notice preferentially those things that are most important. And what he found was that this set of neurons were actually sort of a set of circles at each input between the vertebrae where the nerves come in and also the nerves from the face and so on. There was this little circle. And these circles communicated up and down so that essentially it acted like a committee, but a committee in which everyone could talk and everyone could listen at the same moment. Can you picture that kind of a group of people, say 6 or 8 people, and they could all talk and all listen at the same moment? Unfortunately, we can't do that with our speaking, but nerves can do it. And out of this, the element with the most urgent information took control. So that, let's say, this is the information from the hand, and the hand is sitting on a stove, and somebody just turned on the stove. That becomes the most urgent information, and that organizes the whole thing, organizes the whole organism to, remove the hand from the stove or do whatever's necessary. And that whatever incoming information seemed to be the most urgent, that temporarily took control. He gave another example of the Battle of Midway. In the early years of World War II, there was a large Japanese fleet approaching Midway Island, and the American fleet was out there too, and they had a big battle. It was quite decisive in whether the Japanese were going to take over Hawaii or not, which Hawaii is a big outpost way out there and was very advantageous for the war. And the flagship, the command ship, was knocked out in the first 15 minutes of battle. So it's like removing the executive function. And the admiral, the guy who was in charge of the whole thing, couldn't talk to anybody. And what they did was very wonderful and very creative. They all talked at the same time, basically, on the same frequency. They're very terse. They just give little bits of information, like airplanes coming in over here, enemy destroyer over here, blah, blah, blah. And they, by consensus, decided on who had the most urgent information in terms of the battle. And temporarily, that ship had control. And the control rotated around the fleet. And it was probably decisive in winning the battle. But that's an example of how the reticular activating system works and how our bodies work. That whatever's most urgent at any particular time temporarily takes charge and is the executive function and decides what's going to be done. So that's the healthy functioning. Let me give you an example of where this breaks down. This can be a very useful way to examine problems that people have and get some idea about what might need to be done. I saw a video recently of a woman who was bulimic. She would drink nothing but Diet Pepsi for 3 days in a row, 0 calories, no calories at all. And then essentially there would be a revolution, and she would pig out and eat a whole bunch of stuff. And then she'd feel terrible about herself, and then she'd puke it all up again. Now that's an example of a rigid hierarchy. There's something in there that says being very slim is very, very important, either socially or sexually or something, I don't know. But for her, that's a very high, extreme, the top of the hierarchy, and so that governs everything below, and including hunger pangs. And so for 3 days she eats nothing, and then finally the hunger takes over. So finally, a little bit of heterarchy takes over. And then, so she waffles around and falls apart. Now, in most of our functioning, we eat a little bit every day. We might want to get slender, so we eat a little bit less every day or something like that, and not have this huge swings that you can get in a system in which there's a rigid hierarchy imposed on a heterarchy. So our values function hierarchically. And even though it's useful to have a general sense of what's more important to you, it's always a bit of an overgeneralization. Because our values change place to place. Our values change person to person, context to context. And if you respect that natural functioning, oh, by the way, this reticular activating system has been around for hundreds of millions of years. All vertebrates and I think some other lower animals have fundamentally the same kind of system to organize behavior. And it makes sense. You have lots of different needs. Even a simple animal has many different needs. And they need to find some kind of balance and some way to interact so that one isn't always in charge all the time, so that they can take turns and either contextually or over time so that all the different needs of the organism are met. So it's a very old system, and it hasn't changed significantly in hundreds of millions of years. So it must be a pretty effective way of organizing any complex system. Now, if you think about it, a business that works well will be a heterarchy. Let's say a business is rolling along and everything's going pretty well, and then there's some problem down in the production department. They got the wrong kind of glue or something like that, and it's messing up the whole system. That should become the central organizing principle for what to be done at that moment. Now, in many places, that's not the case. But if there's a rigid hierarchy, and the boss is the boss, and everybody takes order from the boss, yes, sir, and so on, then the system eventually falls apart because certain needs are not met. The system stops functioning after a while. It just doesn't work. Okay. Another good metaphor or example, really, of a heterarchy is an ecology. If you study a particular part of a jungle, there's the rainfall, there's the ground, there's the myriads of different animals, the different plants and vines and trees and bushes, and it's a heterarchy. It's a balanced system. There's a fluctuating balance, goes back and forth. We like to talk, we tend to impose hierarchical thinking on natural. For instance, we talk about the top carnivore in an ecological system. The top carnivore is the animal that eats other animals and is not eaten in turn. Well, you know what? There's no such animal. Bacteria get us all in the end. So if we really want to talk about a top carnivore, decay bacteria are really the top carnivore because they eat everybody. All the plants and all the animals as well, including themselves and each other. So in hierarchy, everything is very complex. There's this complex relationship that shifts and changes. If a particular part of jungle gets hit by a hurricane and a lot of big trees are knocked down, it shifts the allocation of resources and so on, and little trees start growing in where they couldn't before because the canopy was too dark, and so on and so on. And some bugs are wiped out, and others have a field day. Right now, we're having a really wet summer, and I've noticed that I live out in the country, and the morning glories are just going berserk. The morning glory vines are everywhere, and they're covering all these other plants. So there's a temporary imbalance there. Of course, we'll have a dry summer, and then the morning glories will be really tiny, and then the grasses can come up and have a better time. So this is how our values really work. I think that's about all I want to say about values, except that they're tremendously subjective. And I've got a favorite quote on objectivity here, because we're really talking in most of NLP, and I think in most of science, really, about subjective experience, even when it's most, quote, objective, like physics and atom bombs, things like that. And if you think about the things that you enjoy doing that you know many other people would not enjoy doing, that gives you a sense of how subjective values are. I mean, I do things that other people would think are totally crazy. And I look at guys who are climbing up these fierce vertical cliffs without any protective equipment. I think they're absolutely nuts. And they'd have to pay me enormous amounts of money to do that. And yet they will pay money to do that. Well, likewise, I sit at my desk and I do stuff at my desk that most people will think is absolutely nuts. And that's part of the wonderful thing about modern society is that we can do all sorts of, we have a huge range of options. And we can have fun in lots and lots of different ways. If you think about deer, for instance, they eat, they sleep, they have sex, and kind of that's about it, you know, as far as we know. And we can have all these things that we can have fun doing. So back to objectivity. This is a quote from Heinz von Förster, who's one of these Illuminati and systems theory. It is semantically and syntactically correct to say that subjective statements are made by subjects, right? Correspondingly, we may say that objective statements are made by objects. It is only too damn bad that these damn things don't make any such statements. And if you think about it, even when a scientist makes some statement about neutrinos or alternate universes or something like that, he's always saying, given these presuppositions, given these assumptions, using these particular methods of observations and these mathematical, statistical, blah, 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 this is what we have observed. That's really the limit of what they can say. So they can say this seems to be true as far as we know, given all this basic stuff. So even in, quote, objective knowledge, there's always a huge subjective component. And that's really, really true in terms of values. Different people have different values. And so that's about all I'm going to say on values. My job will be to build a self-concept that accords with your values and leave the values to you. Any questions about the values? Okay, let's start in getting a little bit more specific. The power of self-concept. This is in your notes, and there's a list there which I'll be going over. One is the self-concept is a huge generalization. When I say, goodness gracious. If I say to you, I'm a tenacious person, that means I keep going on something. I can start on a project and carry through over a period of weeks or months or years or something and carry through. Well, is it always true? No. I've got lots of projects that are in the corner that I haven't been tenacious about at all. There have been many things that I just looked at and go, I don't want to be tenacious about that, and I put it aside completely. So when I say I'm a tenacious person, it's a huge overgeneralization. It's a useful one because it means that I have a sense that when I really want to do something, I can become tenacious, and I know that I can do that, and I've got all sorts of memories that back that up of times when I spent a long time doing something. It's a huge generalization that goes across time and space. If I ask you, well, what kind of a kid were you when you were 3 years old? Most of you would consider that a reasonable question. You might say, oh, well, I was a quiet kid, or I was really interested in music, or this, that, and the other, or whatever. Well, think about it. Are you the same person as when you were 3 years old? Are you the same person as you were when you were half your present age? Not really. So that's part of this huge generalization thing. And yet, it builds continuity. Bandler used to joke about, you know, this guy was in a seminar, his name was Bob, and we walked into the next room, his name was still Bob. Now, that's kind of a ridiculous way of pointing out that our identity goes with us into different contexts. It goes with us into the next room. And it goes across space and time. And that's one of the things that makes it so powerful, because if I make a change in my identity, it doesn't just make a change in, say, a phobic situation, or when I'm spelling words or driving a car, it makes changes throughout all my life, because a change in identity pervades, it goes out throughout all space and time. One person I talked with once said that he worked on his identity once, and he'd always thought of himself as a poor boy. And I'm not sure what this means. Anybody who comes from Texas might be able to enlighten me. But it meant something, and it was part of his self-concept. And his wife had always worried about his driving. His driving was always kind of reckless. When he changed his identity of being a poor boy, his driving became much more serene and rational, at least to his wife's. Now, what's the link between those? Well, sometimes you can't find the link between them, but somehow in that person's brain, being a poor boy meant that you drove fairly recklessly, and being whatever it was that he became meant that you drove in a different way. So it's one of these things can really, when you make a change in identity, it can affect many, many, many specific attitudes and behaviors, because self-concept goes through space and time.
Is this because we acquire new values, maybe, when we change identity?
It doesn't necessarily. It could mean that you change your values. But very often the values remain the same. It's simply that you choose different experiences. From your storehouse of memories. You see, I have plenty of memories of being mean to people and being abrasive and other people being upset with me and so on. I've got a whole bunch of those. If that was part of my principal self-concept, I could think of myself as being abrasive and cruel. That wouldn't be any less true than what I think of myself now as being kind. It's because I'm selecting where I want to go. And that's another piece that we'll get to very soon here. It's your self-concept is a feed-forward system. It goes into the future. And that's one of the things that makes it so powerful. So what you were suggesting was that someone might have a change in values and that might spur a change in self-concept. And I'm saying, yes, that can happen. But you can, even keeping the same values, you can change your self-concept. I might think of myself as mean and not like it. And then if I reselect and I think of all the times when I was kind to someone and have a self-concept of kindness, now it's in accord with my values, now I can have self-esteem. But it really has to do with selection down here. And of course, what you select might be in terms of your values, or it might be in terms of what other people have told you, or all sorts of other influences. And those things I'm not going to go into much. You know, we could spend days probably talking about the influence of society and parents on selecting values, of the media, and all the impact that has on people's self-concept and who they are and so on. And a lot of that could be very useful, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go for the structure. How do we select and collect? And how do we build a self-concept that's in accord with whatever values you have? Now, contrast your self-concept goes through space and time. Contrast that with a phobia. Phobia is very contextual. Say somebody has a phobia of water or elevators, or my favorite is stuffed olives. There was some lady who had a phobia of stuffed olives. I can't imagine how she got that one. But typically in the situation that creates a phobia, the person has a very, very limited focus of attention. They're scared to death by some event, and whatever they happen to be focused on is what they're become phobic to. And so somehow I guess this lady was focused on a stuffed olive at the time she was deathly afraid. One case that my wife worked with was a woman who had a phobia of not seeing her feet. And that occurred in the context of, she was on one of these flat boats that they use in swamps where it's very shallow water. And this little kid was 9 years old or something, standing on the flat end of this boat. Somebody pulled on the oar. She lost her balance. She stayed upright. But at the moment of absolute panic, she was looking down, and her feet were in the muddy water. She couldn't see her feet. And that's what she became phobic of. So she couldn't ski in deep snow. And she couldn't do anything, basically, where her feet were covered and the rest of her was visible, which is, again, a kind of a strange one. But apparently that's just that focus of attention. But back to the point. A phobia only occurs in certain contexts. If you cure someone's phobia, they're better in that context. And it may be a wonderful thing for them because now they can ride airplanes or they can swim in water and things like that. But the change is restricted to that context. In contrast, when you change self-concept, it goes across context. Now, feed-forward system. My favorite example of this is a joke. A guy wakes up in the Army, he's a private, and he wakes up one morning and he starts looking everywhere, all over his barracks and under his bed, and goes through his kit box and so on, and he goes through other people's beds and stuff, and he's searching. And his commanding officer says, well, what seems to be the problem, son? He says, well, I'm looking for a piece of paper. Well, what is it? I don't know. Well, what does it look like? I don't know. Did you lose it? No, I don't know. I have to have this piece of paper. I have to have it. And he's just obsessively searching everywhere for this piece of paper. And after a while, he decides, well, we better send this guy over to a psychiatrist. So he does the same thing in the psychiatrist's office, searching for this piece of paper, and I'm looking for it. The psychiatrist asks the same kind of questions. Well, what is it? And did you lose it? And no. I have to have it. He's searching everywhere. And after several days of this, the psychiatrist kind of gives up. And he says, well, I think we better give you a psychiatric discharge. And as he signs the paper and hands it over to the guy, he says, there it is. Now, it's really the same thing that we do all the time when we set a goal. When we decide to go to the moon, we go, well, we want to send some guy to the moon. Maybe we better send two guys just for insurance. So if one of them gets appendicitis on the way, we'll still be able to get them back. So here's the Earth, and here's the moon, and the moon's going around like that. And, of course, the Earth's going around. I'm not sure if that's correct, but I think they go in the same direction. Anyway, so we're going to send two guys. We're going to send them off. We're going to land them on the moon, and then we're going to get them back. So this becomes the end goal, getting them back, because this has more to do with, this is really the end goal. And then we're going to figure out, okay, misplaced all my things. Well, in order to get them back, we've got to have a capsule that's so big, it's got to have a certain amount of oxygen and this and the other, and a heat shield, and it's got to come in at a certain angle, blah, blah, blah. And then we work back this way. We do backward planning to decide, well, what are we going to launch here? Oh, a separate module that's going to land on the moon. The rest is just going to go into orbit and so on. It's called backward planning in business. It's called fantasy trip in some psychologies, or it's called goal setting. It's called many, many things. But you set up a goal, the as-if frame in NLP. Well, just pretend as if you had this capability. What would that be like, and so on and so on. You set up a situation where the future here essentially determines the past. Here's the future. You're going to get some guy landing in the ocean in a space capsule. The characteristics of the future actually works backward to determine what are you going to do now in order to get there. Just like the guy in the Army. What's he going to do now in order to get where he wants to go? And the self-concept is a feed-forward system. You are setting up, just as in the swish pattern, this is the you of the future, the evolved you of the future. The person who has these qualities that for whom the old response, getting angry or biting your nails or drinking or whatever it is, just simply is passé. It's one of those things that, like so many things you got over as you matured. Many things you did as a child you don't do any now because you've gone beyond that. If you didn't have a cookie when you were a kid, all you knew how to do was yell for it and scream or lie on the floor and have a tantrum. Now you can bake your own cookies, or you can go to a store and buy cookies, or you can decide you don't want cookies. All sorts of possibilities. So self-concept is a feed-forward system. You are setting up who you want to be, who you are and who you want to be. And whereas in the physical world, the process of getting a guy to the moon and back took a number of years to build all the hardware and do the math and figure out just exactly how much they'd need and all the rest. But a feed-forward system in a computer, which our brain is essentially, is very, very fast. It works just about as fast as nerve conduction, the signal in the system. And so in this, you know how fast the swish is. When you do a swish well, got all the submodalities lined up, it happens very, very quickly. You become that image of the future, essentially instantaneously. Maybe it's 2 seconds, I don't know. Maybe it's 4, I don't know. But it's very, very fast. Because that occurs in the information system, whereas this has to occur in the physical land of physical reality of building the rockets and firing them off and doing the math and all the rest of it. So self-concept is a feed-forward system. And as I've already mentioned, it's recursive. You are the picture that's out there, and you are also the person who makes the image that's out there. And when I say image, I mean not just visual image, it can also be auditory, kinesthetic, and so on. And this can work, both ways. The old thing of a vicious cycle. If you think you're clumsy, you'll start noticing the times when you're clumsy. You'll start noticing the times when you bump into things, and this will reinforce the belief that you are a clumsy person. If you think of yourself as graceful, you will tend to accumulate examples, experiences of being graceful. And you'll notice when you reach over something with grace and ease. And you'll notice when you walk through a door and you're going right through the middle in a very smooth way and so on. And this is another thing. As soon as you set up a generalization, well, you kind of know this already, but we'll get into more details about just how this happens. Where am I back here? As soon as you build one of these things, a collection of images or experiences that you have selected from your past or your future, as soon as you build one of these, it tends to accumulate more of them. Think of yourself as clumsy, you'll tend to accumulate, as life goes on, you'll accumulate more experiences that reinforce that. And the larger your collection is, the more magnetism it has, so to speak, to really pick up other examples. And that can work both ways. As I mentioned, if you think you're clumsy, you'll get more clumsy. If you think you're skillful and graceful, you'll get more skillful and graceful. And that's this recursive thing where it feeds on itself. You are the person who is having the self-concept as well as the person who is being the self-concept. You are the generalization. That's who you are. You are the map of yourself. And you'll never know the territory, except a little bit. But if that knowing of the territory is aligned with your values, it's aligned with your outcomes and where you want to go, you'll get there. Now I think it's time for a break. Let's have a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll start going to work.